American government, Congress, and constituency. How would you like a job where you show up at the office on a Tuesday morning, at the end of the day on Thursday, you get to leave for the weekend, and you get paid about $200,000 a year? Such is the life of most members of Congress, House and Senate alike, when they're in session on Capitol Hill, Washington. But at the end of the day on Thursday, you generally head straight for the airport. You fly back to your home state or your home district, and there you will spend much of the next 4 days talking to local groups, meeting with donors, and essentially trying to continuously build support for your next election campaign. A recent study found that members of Congress work about 70 hours a week on average. That compares with 42 hours for the average American worker. The members of Congress have about half as much personal and family time as the average American. Why did they do it then? Why is serving in Congress worth it to the people seeking office? To the framers of the Constitution, Congress was the most important branch of government. It is the first article. It possesses the government's most important power, the power to write the nation's laws. In the words of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, all legislative powers shall be vested in the Congress, legislation. The American Congress and its two branches, the Senate and the House, 100, 435, one-body Congress, is a unique type of national legislature. One thing, it operates within a system of divided powers. It has legislative power while the president holds executive power. But the president also has the power to veto or reject or sign legislation that Congress writes. Congress has no choice but to keep the president in mind when it goes about its legislative responsibilities. That's different from a parliamentary system, as in England. Parliamentary system, where the prime minister has control over both the legislative branch and the executive branch. Congress is also unique in another regard. It is bicameral, or it has two chambers, the House and the Senate. Most national legislatures are bicameral. What's unusual is that the House and Senate are co-equal chambers in the United States. In most other countries, these chambers are not equally powerful. In Germany, for instance, the weaker chamber can temporarily block action by the stronger one, but typically can't stop it. Not so in the U.S. Congress. For a bill to become a law in the United States, it must be passed in identical form by both the House and the Senate separately. If a bill is passed by one chamber but not the other, it is dead. If a bill differs in its Senate and House versions, and the two chambers cannot agree on a compromise version, it is dead. What truly distinguishes Congress from most other national legislatures is the degree to which its members are free agents. In most other countries, the members of the legislature are quite dependent on their political party. They cannot hope to hold office unless the party organization deems to nominate them for office. Once in office, they risk being denied renomination if they fail to back the party on key bills. Not surprisingly, they all mostly try to toe the party line internationally. Our Congress is different in this respect. The United States is almost alone in using primary elections where the voters, rather than the party organizations, choose the final party nominees for office. And of course, this is done at the state level. You don't even have to be a Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary in many states, and vice versa. The candidate who wins the primary becomes the party's nominee in the general election, even if the party organization would prefer someone else. In the U.S., the public at large has a hand in influencing party politics, even though they may or may not be official party members. In the American system, individual House and Senate candidates run for office on their own. They raise most of their own campaign funds, they create their own campaign organizations, and they choose the issues on which they'll campaign. At the national level, they typically get some help from the party, but for the most part, they win or lose on their own. As a result, members of Congress are mostly free to vote as they would please when a bill comes up for a vote. As you would expect, most of them have more in common with other members of their party than they do with the opposite party. So they can usually support the party's position, but they can't be forced to do so. When Bob Dole was a Republican leader in the Senate, he remarked, "There are a lot of free spirits in the Senate, about 100 of them. 100 of them, that's the entire membership of the U.S. Senate. When push comes to shove, each member of Congress operates as a free agent." The key to winning elections in the American system is constituency support, the backing of the voters in the candidate's home state or district. You and I are constituents, citizens who are represented by elected leaders. What we think of our representatives matters to our representatives, since we hold the key to their election and then re-election. To elect its Senate and House members, the United States employs what's called a single-member plurality district system, which is often more commonly called a first-past-the-post system. First past the post. In it, each elected official is chosen individually from a state, in the case of the Senate, or a distinct district, congressional district, in the case of each member of the House of Representatives. Remember, there are 435 across the country. These are equally sized by population. The candidate with the most votes wins the election. This type of election system differs from a proportional representation system, which is what Western democracies more frequently use. Under a proportional representation system, which we do not have, parties win legislative seats in proportion to the percentage of votes they receive in a national election. A party that receives 35% of the national vote gets 35% of the seats in the parliament, for instance. One that wins 20% of the votes gets 20% of the seats, and so on. Ours is hyper-specific and focused to place. In a proportional representation system, individual candidates do not have to please the voters directly. They win or lose office depending on how well their party does in the national vote. America's single-member district system of elections is far different. We do not vote for parties. We vote for people, although we sometimes forget it. This explains why members of Congress fly back to their home state or district on weekends to give talks and meet with community leaders constantly. They're seeking to build the local support necessary to come out on top in the next election. They need voter support as the framers intended. Congressional staffs also contribute to the vote-getting effort. Members of Congress have much larger personal staffs than do members of other national legislatures. In other countries, a member of the national legislature might have 1 or 2 staff members. U.S. senators, on the other hand, often have at the direction staffs of 30 or more people, while many House members have nearly 20 people on staff. Some of these staff work on legislative issues, but most work on thinly disguised re-election campaign efforts. Staff members put out press releases, help constituents with their problems, arrange speaking events, all with an eye toward building the member support among those in his or her state or district ahead of the next election. Constituency influence is also apparent in the legislative work of members of Congress, particularly in their service on congressional committees. Most legislative work in Congress takes place in standing committees, standing formal committees. They're called standing committees because they're always ongoing. Each of them has a continuing responsibility for legislation within its policy area. Currently, there are 20 standing committees in the House and 16 in the Senate. Each chamber has, for example, an Armed Services Committee, a Budget Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, a Small Business Committee, etc. Most legislative work takes place in these committees. Congress considers several thousand bills each session, and it could not manage this workload if each bill was studied by every individual member, so the members are divided into committees for initial consideration. Recall that the Senate is apportioned by state, 2 for each, for a total of 100 members in the Senate. In contrast, the House of Representatives is apportioned by population. With 435 members of the House, it's more than 4 times the size of the Senate. Those differences are reflected in the size of the committees. For instance, the House Ag Committee has 45 members, while the Senate Ag Committee has 20 members. Each committee has its own jurisdiction, a term that refers to the policy area in which it's authorized to act. Jurisdiction. After a bill is introduced by a House or Senate member, it is assigned to the committee with jurisdiction over bills of that type. The standing committee can't pass a bill on its own. That requires a vote by the full chamber, either the House or the Senate. The committees have the power to rewrite bills that are introduced. This authority is called markup. The power to change a bill's provisions. The committee can change or amend a bill as it sees fit. After a bill is worked up in committee, and if it has the support of the majority of the committee members, which will cross party lines, it is submitted to the full chamber for consideration. The full chamber can amend or defeat the bill as well. If it passes, it typically is close in form and content to what the committee decided previously. It doesn't generally change much out of committee. Committees are also the mechanism through which Congress exercises what is called oversight responsibilities. This is key. Congress has a responsibility to see that the executive branch faithfully administers the laws that Congress writes. Each committee oversees the activities of its parallel executive agency. The House and Senate Ag Committees, for example, oversee the Department of Agriculture, which are administered by the executive branch. If a congressional committee thinks an agency has acted improperly, it can call hearings and require the agency's officials to appear and testify to their actions. There's a final thing to note about congressional committees, and that's the question of who serves on them. Members are typically assigned to committees to handle issues specifically affecting their constituency. This usually trumps the education and job backgrounds of these members of Congress, though that is often a factor as well. The House and Senate Ag committees, for example, are stacked with members from farm states, whether those representatives who are elected have ever ridden in a cab of a tractor or milked a cow in their lives. Similarly, the Armed Services Committee includes a disproportionate number of senators from states with major military installations, such as the states of Texas and North Carolina, again, whether or not those members of Congress ever served in the United States military. Committee assignments such as these enable members of Congress to look after the interests of their constituents. It also gives them an inside track on campaign contributions from groups that benefit from the committee's decisions. In the most recent election cycle, for example, ag, business, and interest groups donated 30% of their total annual campaign donations to members of the House and Senate ag committees, even though these members make up barely 10% of Congress. Just being in Congress already is an advantage when it comes to raising campaign dollars. Groups donate mostly to incumbents, those currently serving in office and seeking re-election. If you've already elected, you are an incumbent. Because groups recognize that a large majority of them, generally more than 80%, will win re-election against their competitor. Less than 20% of a group's campaign contributions go to candidates who are challenging someone who's running for re-election. In a few moments, I'll discuss a case, the 2014 Farm Bill, that illustrates the constituency influence on congressional action. Before doing so, let's think about legislation in terms of its costs and benefits, though. Legislative costs and benefits, pros and cons. The benefits of legislation that Congress writes can be either concentrated or diffuse. An example of a bill with concentrated benefits is one that allocates money to assist a specific group of people, say, new federal funding for state unemployment benefits, as we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic. If you meet the eligibility requirements for that benefit, you get it. In that sense, the benefit is concentrated. It goes to those designated as eligible to receive it and no one else. On the other hand, an example of a diffuse benefit would be space exploration. America's space program is generally regarded as beneficial, but almost all Americans would have difficulty identifying the ways in which they have benefited directly from the many billions and billions and billions of dollars the United States has poured into its space program over the past 50 years. By keeping those distinctions in mind, let's assume for a moment that you are a member of Congress. Congratulations. In terms of improving your re-election chances, what type of legislation might you regard as more important? When benefits are concentrated, the people receiving benefits will notice it and be grateful for it. They might even vote for you because of your support for the bill. In contrast, if the benefit of a piece of legislation is diffuse, the beneficiaries might not take notice of it. It's often not tangible enough to be felt or understood when it comes time to actually vote in the voting booth. Now let's think about costs in this legislative equation. As with benefits, costs can either be concentrated or diffuse. An example of a bill that imposes a concentrated cost is one that would require the owners of a coal-fired power plant to reduce their carbon emissions or face fines. The cost would be imposed directly on those businesses. In contrast, an example of legislation that would impose a diffuse cost is diplomacy. We have diplomatic efforts going on around the world, but the costs of those efforts are distributed across the entire tax-paying public. Now assume again that you're a member of Congress. In terms of improving your re-election chances, what type of legislation would you find more advantageous to support? Because the cost of the diplomatic bill spread widely, its impact on the individual taxpayer is not likely to be noticed. Very few people will be impacted so directly as to vote against you because you support a bill on diplomacy. On the other hand, if the costs were concentrated on a particular group, the group would obviously notice it, and its constituent members might be angry enough to vote against you, or even coordinate their support for your opposition to the next election. Let's combine these two dimensions, the benefits and costs, to identify the type of bill that best serves a member's re-election needs. That bill would necessarily be one that provides a concentrated benefit to some group, one recognized and appreciated by those receiving it, while having a cost that is spread so widely across the taxpaying public that it goes virtually unnoticed. Concentrated benefit and diffuse cost. That's the ideal bill for a member of Congress who makes re-election their priority. It makes some voters very happy while barely registering with the overwhelming majority. Here's an example of a bill that has these two features, a concentrated benefit and a diffuse cost that can help a member of Congress get re-elected. The bill was passed in late 2011, a few years after the Great Recession swept much of the world. It was a time when congressional Republicans and Democrats were deadlocked over budget issues, with Republicans striving for cuts in government spending, while Democrats were striving to impose tax increases. Despite these differences, they found time to pass a particular bill. The vote was 422 to nothing in the House, with some abstaining or not voting, 95 to none in the Senate, meaning that every Republican and every Democrat present in Congress that day voted for this bill. So what was this bill? The bill authorized the spending of $1.7 billion to help military veterans find jobs. The bill was good politics for every member of Congress. The bill offered a concentrated benefit while diffusing the costs. Veterans alone would receive it and be thankful for it, while the cost was diffused across the entire taxpaying public, so that its effect on any given taxpayer would be too small to be noticed. The redistributive consequences of the bill, redistributive. Indeed, the taxpayers would still be paying for this bill, was not so concentrated as to engender organized resistance, in part because the U.S. public generally is keen to support military veterans and their families. An example of a redistributive policy would be tax legislation that both increases taxes on higher incomes in order to reduce taxes on lower incomes. That type of bill makes one group happy, but it angers the other. That's a riskier bill for a member of Congress to support because it involves clear trade-offs in society and among the constituency. The losing group might take out its anger on the member of Congress in the next election. Such legislation has become increasingly rare in Congress. Instead of finding ways to broker their policy differences in recent years, members of Congress have sought to alter their own legislative rules or calendars to force disputed legislation. They've increased the complexity and vagueness of the bills that they write. They cede what authority they can to the executive branch, or to the federal bureaucracy, or even to the court system. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, passed by a razor-thin margin in Congress in 2009, offers a recent example of such torturous legislation. Re-election concerns are the primary reason distributive policy bills, instead of redistributive policy bills, tend to get enacted. Such bills typically address a vocal demand and do not attract an equally vocal opposition. The Veterans Bill is a very good example. Pell Grants, that you might be familiar with, provide another example. Pell Grants are distributive. They allocate a concentrated benefit, college aid to students from middle and lower income families, while diffusing the costs across the taxpaying public, including many millions of taxpayers who never went to college themselves. Moreover, the perceived benefit to society of Pell Grants goes beyond the students who get help. Most people believe that society as a whole benefits when it has more educated workforce members. That's typically the case with distributive policy bills. It's easy to infer a social benefit and harder to pinpoint a cost perceived as especially unfair or burdensome. The fact that such bills also serve the re-election interests of members of Congress means that such bills are far more likely than other bills to attract congressional support necessary to become law. As you might have concluded, congressional incumbents stand a good chance of getting re-elected. This can be attributed to their ability to claim credit for supporting popular distributive legislation. Incumbents also have other advantages over their election challengers, everything from their campaign fundraising advantage to their ability to promote legislation beneficial to their constituents. I signed that bill. I put my name on that. Simply having more recognition among voters when they actually stand in the voting booth. In recent years, over 90% of House incumbents seeking re-election have actually won their campaigns. The percentage is somewhat lower for Senate incumbents, but they have a very high probability of victory as well. Once in Congress, you stand a good chance of being able to stay there, particularly if you're good at directing federal revenue to your constituents, your district, while shielding yourself from blame for the compounding costs of all of this wonderful debt-funded federal legislation. If and when our ability to run trillion-dollar annual budget deficits ends, what it takes to be reelected to Congress will look far different from what it takes to be reelected today.